Welcome to Faladicious Studio again. This channel channels all stories, both historical and present, that everyone need to know. Let's talk about the first American president as we explore. Subscribe if you are new in the channel. George Washington, born February 22, February 11, Old Style, 1732, Westmoreland County, Virginia, U.S. Died December 14, 1799, Mount Vernon, Virginia, U.S. American general and commander-in-chief of the colonial armies in the American Revolution, 1775–83, and subsequently first president of the United States, 1789–97. Washington's father, Augustine Washington, had gone to school in England, tasted seafaring life, and then settled down to manage his growing Virginia estates. His mother was Mary Ball, whom Augustine, a widower, had married early the previous year. Washington's paternal lineage had some distinction. An early forebear was described as a gentleman. Henry VIII later gave the family lands, and its members held various offices. But family fortunes fell with the Puritan Revolution in England, and John Washington, grandfather of Augustine, migrated in 1657 to Virginia. The ancestral home at Soulgrave, Northamptonshire, is maintained as a Washington memorial. Little definite information exists on any of the line until Augustine. He was an energetic, ambitious man who acquired much land, built mills, took an interest in opening iron mines, and sent his two eldest sons to England for schooling. By his first wife, Jane Bidler, he had 4 children. By his second wife, Mary Ball, he had 6. Augustine died April 12, 1743. Childhood and youth. Little is known of George Washington's early childhood, spent largely on the Ferry Farm on the Rappahannock River, opposite Fredericksburg, Virginia. Mason L. Weems's stories of the hatchet and cherry tree, and of young Washington's repugnance to fighting are apocryphal efforts to fill a manifest gap. He attended school irregularly from his 7th to his 15th year, first with the local church sexton, and later with a schoolmaster named Williams. Some of his school board papers survive. He was fairly well trained in practical mathematics, gauging, several types of mensuration, and such trigonometry as was useful in surveying. He studied geography, possibly had a little Latin, and certainly read some of The Spectator and other English classics. The copybook in which he transcribed at 14 a set of moral precepts, or rules of civility and decent behavior in company and conversation, was carefully preserved. His best training, however, was given him by practical men and outdoor occupations, not by books. He mastered tobacco growing and stock raising, and early in his teens, he was sufficiently familiar with surveying to plot the fields about him. At his father's death, the 11-year-old boy became the ward of his half-brother Lawrence, a man of fine character who gave him wise and affectionate care. Lawrence inherited the beautiful estate of Little Hunting Creek, which had been granted to the original settler, John Washington, and which Augustine had done much since 1738 to develop. Lawrence married Anne Nancy Fairfax, daughter of Col. William Fairfax, a cousin and agent of Lord Fairfax, and one of the chief proprietors of the region. Lawrence also built a house and named the 2,500-acre, 1,000-hectare, holding Mount Vernon in honor of the admiral under whom he had served in the siege of Cartagena, living there chiefly with Lawrence, though he spent some time near Fredericksburg with his other half-brother, Augustine, called Austin. George entered a more spacious and polite world, and Fairfax Washington was a woman of charm, grace, and culture. Lawrence had brought from his English school and naval service much knowledge and experience. A valued neighbor and relative, George William Fairfax, whose large estate, Beaver, was about 4 miles, 6 kilometers, distant, and other relatives by marriage, the Carlyles of Alexandria, helped form George's mind and manners. The youth turned first to surveying as a profession. Lord Fairfax, a middle-aged bachelor who owned more than 5 million acres, 2 million hectares, in northern Virginia and the Shenandoah Valley, came to America in 1746 to live with his cousin George William at Beaver and to look after his properties. 2 years later, he sent to the Shenandoah Valley a party to survey and plot his lands to make regular tenants of the squatters moving in from Pennsylvania. With the official surveyor of Prince William County in charge, Washington went along as assistant. The 16-year-old lad kept a disjointed diary of the trip, which shows skill in observation, He describes the discomfort of sleeping under one threadbare blanket with double its weight of vermin such as lice, fleas, and an encounter with an Indian war party bearing a scalp. The Pennsylvania German immigrants, as ignorant a set of people as the Indians, they would never speak English, but when spoken to, they speak all Dutch. And the serving of roast wild turkey on a large ship. For as for dishes, we had none. The following year, 1749, aided by Lord Fairfax, Washington received an appointment as official surveyor of Culpeper County, and for more than 2 years he was kept almost constantly busy, surveying not only in Culpeper, but also in Frederick and Augusta counties. He made journeys far beyond the Tidewater region into the western wilderness. The experience taught him resourcefulness and endurance and toughened him in both body and mind. Coupled with Lawrence's ventures in land, it also gave him an interest in Western development that endured throughout his life. He was always disposed to speculate in Western holdings and to view favorably projects for colonizing the West. And he greatly resented the limitations that the Crown in time laid on the westward movement. In 1752, Lord Fairfax determined to take up his final residence in the Shenandoah Valley and settled there in a log hunting lodge, which he called Greenway Court after a Kentish manner of his family's. There Washington was sometimes entertained and had access to a small library that Fairfax had begun accumulating at Oxford. The years 1751 to 52 marked a turning point in Washington's life, for they placed him in control of Mount Vernon. Lawrence, stricken by tuberculosis, went to Barbados in 1751 for his health, taking George along. From this sole journey beyond the present borders of the United States, Washington returned with the light scars of an attack of smallpox. In July of the next year, Lawrence died, making George executor and residuary heir of his estate should his daughter, Sarah, die without issue. As she died within 2 months, Washington at age 20 became head of one of the best Virginia estates. He always thought farming the most delectable of pursuits. "It is honorable," he wrote. "It is amusing. And, with superior judgment, it is profitable." And of all the spots for farming, he thought Mount Vernon the best. "No estate in United America," he assured an English correspondent, "is more pleasantly situated than this." His greatest pride in later days was to be regarded as the first farmer of the land. He gradually increased the estate until it exceeded 8,000 acres, 3,000 hectares. He enlarged the house in 1760 and made further enlargements and improvements on the house and its landscaping in 1784 to 86. He also tried to keep abreast of the latest scientific advances. For the next 20 years, the main background of Washington's life was the work and society of Mount Vernon. He gave assiduous attention to the rotation of crops, fertilization of the soil, and the management of livestock. He had to manage the 18 slaves that came with the estate, and others he bought later. By 1760, he had paid taxes on 49 slaves, though he strongly disapproved of the institution and hoped for some mode of abolishing it. At the time of his death, more than 300 slaves were housed in the quarters on his property. He had been unwilling to sell slaves lest families be broken up, even though the increase in their numbers placed a burden on him for their upkeep and gave him a larger force of workers than he required, especially after he gave up the cultivation of tobacco. In his will, he bequeathed the slaves in his possession to his wife and ordered that upon her death they be set free, declaring also that the young, the aged, and the infirm among them shall be comfortably clothed and fed by my heirs. Still, this accounted for only about half the slaves on his property. The other half, owned by his wife, were entailed to the Custis estate, so that on her death they were destined to pass to her heirs. However, she freed all the slaves in 1800 after his death. For diversion, Washington was fond of riding, fox hunting, and dancing, of such theatrical performances as he could reach, and of duck hunting and sturgeon fishing. He liked billiards and cards, and not only subscribed to racing associations, but also ran his own horses in races. In all outdoor pursuits, from wrestling to colt breaking, he excelled. A friend of the 1750s describes him as straight as an Indian, measuring 6 feet 2 inches in his stockings, as very muscular and broad-shouldered but, though large-boned, weighing only 175 pounds, and as having long arms and legs. His penetrating blue-gray eyes were overhung by heavy brows. His nose was large and straight, and his mouth was large and firmly closed. His movements and gestures are graceful, his walk majestic, and he is a splendid horseman. He soon became prominent in community affairs, was an active member and later vestryman of the Episcopal Church, and as early as 1755 expressed a desire to stand for the Virginia House of Burgesses. Pre-revolutionary military and political career of George Washington. Early military career. Traditions of John Washington's feats as Indian fighter and Lawrence Washington's talk of service days helped imbue George with military ambition. Just after Lawrence's death, Lieut. Gov. Robert Dinwiddie appointed George adjutant for the Southern District of Virginia at £100 a year. November 1752. In 1753, he became adjutant of the Northern Neck and Eastern Shore. Later that year, Dinwiddie found it necessary to warn the French to desist from their encroachments on Ohio Valley lands claimed by the Crown. After sending one messenger who failed to reach the goal, he determined to dispatch Washington. On the day he received his orders, October 31, 1753, Washington set out for the French posts. His party consisted of a Dutchman to serve as interpreter, the expert scout Christopher Gist as guide, and 4 others, 2 of them experienced traders with the Indians. Theoretically, Great Britain and France were at peace. Actually, war impended, and Dinwiddie's message was an ultimatum. The French must get out or be put out. The journey proved rough, perilous, and futile. Washington's party left what is now Cumberland, Maryland, in the middle of November, and, despite wintry weather and impediments of the wilderness, reached Fort Le Boeuf, at what is now Waterford, Pennsylvania, 20 miles, 32 kilometers, south of Lake Erie, without delay. The French commander was courteous but adamant. As Washington reported, his officers told me that it was their absolute design to take possession of the Ohio, and by God they would do it. Eager to carry this alarming news back, Washington pushed off hurriedly with jest. He was lucky to have gotten back alive. An Indian fired at them at 15 paces but missed. When they crossed the Allegheny River on a raft, Washington was jerked into the ice-filled stream but saved himself by catching one of the timbers. That night he almost froze in his wet clothing. He reached Williamsburg, Virginia, on January 16, 1754, where he hastily penned a record of the journey. Dinwiddie, who was laboring to convince the Crown of the seriousness of the French threat, had it printed, and when he sent it to London, it was reprinted in 3 different forms. The enterprising governor forthwith planned an expedition to hold the Ohio country. He made Joshua Fry colonel of a provincial regiment, appointed Washington lieutenant colonel, and set them to recruiting troops. 2 agents of the Ohio Company, which Lawrence Washington and others had formed to develop plans on the upper Potomac and Ohio rivers, had begun building a fort at what later became Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Dinwiddie, ready to launch into his own war, sent Washington with 2 companies to reinforce this post. In April 1754, the lieutenant colonel set out from Alexandria with about 160 men at his back. He marched to Cumberland only to learn that the French had anticipated the British blow. They had taken possession of the fort of the Ohio Company and had renamed it Fort Duquesne. Happily, the Indians of the area offered support. Washington therefore struggled cautiously forward to within about 40 miles, 60 kilometers, of the French position, and erected his own post at Great Meadows, near what is now Confluence, Pennsylvania. From this base, he made a surprise attack, May 28, 1754, upon an advance detachment of 30 French, killing the commander, Cowlin D. Jumonville, and 9 others and taking the rest prisoners. The French and Indian War had begun. Washington at once received promotion to a full colonelcy and was reinforced, commanding a considerable body of Virginia and North Carolina troops, with Indian auxiliaries. But his attack soon brought the whole French force down upon him. They drove his 350 men into the Great Meadows Fort, Fort Necessity, on July 3, besieged it with 700 men, and, after an all-day fight, compelled him to surrender. The construction of the fort had been a blunder, for it lay in a waterlogged creek bottom, was commanded on 3 sides by forested elevations approaching it closely, and was too far from Washington's supports. The French agreed to let the disarmed colonials march back to Virginia with the honors of war, but they compelled Washington to promise that Virginia would not build another fort on the Ohio for a year, and to sign a paper acknowledging responsibility for l'assassinat of D. Jumonville, a word that Washington later explained he did not rightly understand. He returned to Virginia, chagrined but proud, to receive the thanks of the House of Burgesses, and to find that his name had been mentioned in the London Gazettes. His remark in a letter to his brother that "I have heard the bullets whistle, and believe me, there is something charming in the sound" was commented on humorously by the author Horace Walpole and sarcastically by King George II. The arrival of Gen. Edward Braddock and his army in Virginia in February 1755, as part of the triple plan of campaign that called for his advance on Fort Duquesne, and in New York Gov. William Shirley's capture of Fort Niagara, and Sir William Johnson's capture of Crown Point, brought Washington new opportunities and responsibilities. He had resigned his commission in October 1754 in resentment of the slighting treatment and underpayment of colonial officers, and particularly because of an untactful order of the British War Office that provincial officers of whatever rank would be subordinate to any officer holding the King's commission. But he ardently desired a part in the war. "My inclinations," he wrote a friend, "are strongly bent to arms." When Braddock showed appreciation of his merits and invited him to join the expedition as personal aide-de-camp, with the courtesy title of colonel, he therefore accepted. His self-reliance, decision, and masterfulness soon became apparent. At table he had frequent disputes with Braddock, who, when contractors failed to deliver their supplies, attacked the colonials as supine and dishonest while Washington defended them warmly. His freedom of utterance is proof of Braddock's esteem. Braddock accepted Washington's unwise advice that he divide his army, leaving half of it to come up with the slow wagons and cattle train, and taking the other half forward against Fort Duquesne at a rapid pace. Washington was ill with fever during June, but joined the advance guard in a covered wagon on July 8, begged to lead the march on Fort Duquesne with his Virginians and Indian allies, and was by Braddock's side when on July 9 the army was ambushed and bloodily defeated. In this defeat, Washington displayed the combination of coolness and determination, the alliance of unconquerable energy with complete poise, that was the secret of so many of his successes, so ill that he had to use a pillow instead of a saddle, and that Braddock ordered his body servant to keep special watch over him. Washington was, nevertheless, everywhere at once. At first he followed Braddock as the general bravely tried to rally his men to push either forward or backward, the wisest course the circumstances permitted. Then he rode back to bring up the Virginians from the rear and rallied them with effect on the flank. To him was largely due the escape of the force. His exposure of his person was as reckless as Braddock's, who was fatally wounded on his 5th horse. Washington had 2 horses shot out from under him, and his clothes cut by 4 bullets without being hurt. He was at Braddock's deathbed, helped bring the troops back, and was repaid by being appointed, in August 1755, while still only 23 years old, commander of all Virginia troops. But no part of his later service was conspicuous. Finding that a Maryland captain who held a royal commission would not obey him, he rode north in February 1756 to Boston to have the question settled by the commander-in-chief in America, Governor Shirley, and, bearing a letter from Dinwiddie, had no difficulty in carrying his point. On his return he plunged into a multitude of vexations. He had to protect a weak, thinly settled frontier nearly 400 miles, 650 kilometers, in length with only some 700 ill-disciplined colonial troops, to cope with a legislature unwilling to support him, to meet attacks on the drunkenness and inefficiency of the soldiers, and to endure constant wilderness hardships. It is not strange that in 1757 his health failed, and in the closing weeks of that year he was so ill of a bloody flux, dysentery, that his physician ordered him home to Mount Vernon. In the spring of 1758, he had recovered sufficiently to return to duty as colonel in command of all Virginia troops, as part of the grand sweep of several armies organized by British statesman William Pitt the Elder. General John Forbes led a new advance upon Fort Duquesne. Forbes resolved not to use Braddock's road, but to cut a new one west from Raystown, Pennsylvania. Washington disapproved of the route, but played an important part in the movement. Late in the autumn the French evacuated and burned Fort Duquesne, and Forbes reared Fort Pitt on the site. Washington, who had just been elected to the House of Burgesses, was able to resign with the honorary rank of brigadier general, although his officers expressed regret at the loss of such an excellent commander, such a sincere friend, and so affable a companion. He quit the service with a sense of frustration. He had thought the war excessively slow. The Virginia legislature had been niggardly in voting money. The Virginia recruits had come forward reluctantly and had proved of poor quality. Washington had hanged a few deserters and flogged others heavily. Virginia gave him less pay than other colonies offered their troops. Desiring a regular commission such as his half-brother Lawrence had held, he applied in vain to the British commander in North America, Lord Loudoun, to make good a promise that Braddock had given him. Ambitious for both rank and honor, he showed a somewhat strident vigor in asserting his desires and in complaining when they were denied. He returned to Mount Vernon somewhat disillusioned. Marriage and plantation life of George Washington. Immediately on resigning his commission, Washington was married January 6, 1759, to Martha Dandridge, the widow of Daniel Parke Custis. She was a few months older than he, was the mother of 2 children living and 2 dead, and possessed one of the considerable fortunes of Virginia. Washington had met her the previous March and had asked for her hand before his campaign with Forbes. Though it does not seem to have been a romantic love match, the marriage united 2 harmonious temperaments and proved happy. Martha was a good housewife, an amiable companion, and a dignified hostess. Like many well-born women of the era, she had little formal schooling, and Washington often helped her compose important letters. Some estimates of the property brought to him by this marriage have been exaggerated, but it did include a number of slaves and about 15,000 acres, 6,000 hectares, much of it valuable for its proximity to Williamsburg. More important to Washington were the 2 stepchildren, John Parke, Jackie, and Martha Parke, Patsy Custis, who at the time of the marriage were 6 and 4, respectively. He lavished great affection and care upon them, worried greatly over Jackie's waywardness, and was overcome with grief when Patsy died just before the Revolution. Jackie died during the war, leaving 4 children. Washington adopted 2 of them, a boy and a girl, and even signed his letters to the boy as "Your Papa." Himself childless, he thus had a real family. From the time of his marriage, Washington added to the care of Mount Vernon the supervision of the Custis estate at the White House on the York River. As his holdings expanded, they were divided into farms, each under its own overseer. But he minutely inspected operations every day, and according to one visitor, often pulled off his coat and performed ordinary labor. As he once wrote, "Middling land under a man's own eyes is more profitable than rich land at a distance." Until the eve of the Revolution, he devoted himself to the duties and pleasures of a great landholder, varied by several weeks' attendance every year in the House of Burgesses in Williamsburg. During 1760 to 74, he was also a justice of the peace for Fairfax County, sitting in court in Alexandria. In no light does Washington appear more characteristically than as one of the richest, largest, and most industrious of Virginia planters. For 6 days a week he rose early and worked hard. On Sundays he regularly attended Powhatan Church 16 times in 1760, entertained company, wrote letters, made purchases and sales, and sometimes went fox hunting. In these years he took snuff and smoked a pipe. Throughout life he liked Madeira wine and punch. Although wheat and tobacco were his staples, he practiced crop rotation on a 3-year or 5-year plan. He had his own water-powered flour mill, blacksmith shop, brick and charcoal kilns, carpenters, and masons. His fishery supplied shad, bass, herring, and other catches, salted as food for his slaves. Coopers, weavers, and his own shoemaker turned out barrels, cotton, linen, and woolen goods, and brogans for all needs. In short, his estates, in accordance with his orders to overseers to buy nothing you can make yourselves, were largely self-sufficient communities. But he did send large orders to England for farm implements, tools, paint, fine textiles, hardware, and agricultural books, and hence was painfully aware of British commercial restrictions. Washington was an innovative farmer and a responsible landowner. He experimented at breeding cattle, acquired at least 1 buffalo, with the hope of proving its utility as a meat animal, and kept stallions at stud. He also took pride in a peach and apple orchard. His care of slaves was exemplary. He carefully clothed and fed them, engaged a doctor for them by the year, generally refused to sell the Mayan principle against this kind of traffic in the human species, and administered correction mildly. They showed so much attachment that few ran away. He meanwhile played a prominent role in the social life of the Tidewater region. The members of the Council and House of Burgesses, a roster of influential Virginians, were all friends. He visited the Byrds of Westover, the Lees of Stratford, the Carters of Shirley and Sabine Hall, and the Lewises of Warner Hall. Mount Vernon often was busy with guests in return. He liked house parties and afternoon tea on the Mount Vernon porch overlooking the Grand Potomac. He was fond of picnics, barbecues, and clam bakes. And throughout life he enjoyed dancing, frequently going to Alexandria for balls. Cards were a steady diversion, and his accounts record sums lost at them, the largest reaching nearly 10 pounds. His diary sometimes states that in bad weather he was at home all day, over cards. Billiards was a rival amusement. Not only the theater, when available, but also concerts, cockfights, circuses, puppet shows, and exhibitions of animals received his patronage. He insisted on the best closed coats, laced waistcoats, hats, colored silk hose bought in London. The Virginia of the Randolphs, Corbins, Harrisons, Tylers, Nicholases, and other prominent families had an aristocratic quality, and Washington liked to do things in a large way. It has been computed that in the 7 years prior to 1775, Mount Vernon had 2,000 guests, most of whom stayed to dinner if not overnight. Pre-revolutionary politics. Washington's contented life was interrupted by the rising storm in imperial affairs. The British ministry, facing a heavy post-war debt, high home taxes, and continued military costs in America, decided in 1764 to obtain revenue from the colonies. Up to that time, Washington, though regarded by associates, in Call John L. Payton's words, as a young man of an extraordinary and exalted character, had shown no signs of personal greatness and few signs of interest in state affairs. The proclamation of 1763, interdicting settlement beyond the Alleghenies, irked him, for he was interested in the Ohio Company, the Mississippi Company, and other speculative Western ventures. He nevertheless played a silent part in the House of Burgesses, and was a thoroughly loyal subject, but he was present when Patrick Henry introduced his resolutions against the Stamp Act in May 1765, and shortly thereafter gave token of his adherence to the cause of the colonial Whigs against the Tory ministries of England. In 1768, he told George Mason at Mount Vernon that he would take his musket on his shoulder whenever his country called him. The next spring, on April 4, 1769, he sent Mason the Philadelphia non-importation resolutions with a letter declaring that it was necessary to resist the strokes of our lordly masters in England, that, courteous remonstrances to Parliament having failed, he wholly endorsed the resort to commercial warfare, and that as a last resort no man should scruple to use arms in defense of liberty. When, the following month, the royal governor of Virginia dissolved the House of Burgesses, he shared in the gathering at the Raleigh Tavern in Williamsburg that drew up non-importation resolutions, and he went further than most of his neighbors in adhering to them. At that time and later he believed with most Americans that peace need not be broken. Late in 1770 he paid a land-hunting visit to Fort Pitt, where George Croghan was maturing his plans for the proposed 14th colony of Vandalia. Washington directed his agent to locate and survey 10,000 acres adjoining the Vandalia tract, and at one time he wished to share in certain of Croghan's schemes. But the Boston Tea Party of December 1773 and the bursting of the Vandalia bubble at about the same time turned his eyes back to the East and the threatening state of Anglo-American relations. He was not a member of the Virginia Committee of Correspondence formed in 1773 to communicate with other colonies. But when the Virginia legislators, meeting irregularly again at the Raleigh Tavern in May 1774, called for a Continental Congress, he was present and signed the resolutions. Moreover, he was a leading member of the First Provincial Convention, or Revolutionary Legislature, late that summer, and to that body he made a speech that was much praised for its pithy eloquence, declaring that I will raise 1,000 men, subsist them at my own expense, and march myself at their head for the relief of Boston. The Virginia Provincial Convention promptly elected Washington one of the 7 delegates to the First Continental Congress. He was by this time known as a radical rather than a moderate, and in several letters of the time he opposed the continuance of petitions to the British Crown, declaring that they would inevitably meet with a humiliating rejection. Shall we after this whine and cry for relief when we have already tried it in vain? He wrote. When the Congress met in Philadelphia on September 5, 1774, he was in his seat in full uniform, and his participation in its councils marks the beginning of his national career. His letters of the period show that, while still utterly opposed to the idea of independence, he was determined never to submit to the loss of those valuable rights and privileges which are essential to the happiness of every free state, and without which life, liberty, and property are rendered totally insecure if the ministry pushed matters to an extremity. He wrote, "More blood will be spilled on this occasion than ever before in American history." Though he served on none of the committees, he was a useful member, his advice being sought on military matters, and weight being attached to his advocacy of a non-exportation as well as non-importation agreement. He also helped to secure approval of the Suffolk Resolves, which looked toward armed resistance as a last resort and did much to harden the king's heart against America. Returning to Virginia in November, he took command of the volunteer companies drilling there and served as chairman of the Committee of Safety in Fairfax County. Although the province contained many experienced officers, and Col. William Byrd of Westover had succeeded Washington as commander-in-chief, the unanimity with which the Virginia troops turned to Washington was a tribute to his reputation and personality. It was understood that Virginia expected him to be its general. He was elected to the Second Continental Congress at the March 1775 session of the legislature, and again set out for Philadelphia, revolutionary leadership of George Washington, head of the colonial forces. The choice of Washington as commander-in-chief of the military forces of all the colonies followed immediately upon the first fighting, though it was by no means inevitable, and was the product of partly artificial forces. The Virginia delegates differed upon his appointment. Edmund Pendleton was, according to John Adams, very full and clear against it, and Washington himself recommended General Andrew Lewis for the post. It was chiefly the fruit of a political bargain by which New England offered Virginia the chief command as its price for the adoption and support of the New England Army. This army had gathered hastily and in force about Boston immediately after the clash of British troops and American Minutemen at Lexington and Concord on April 19, 1775. When the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia on May 10, one of its first tasks was to find a permanent leadership for this force. On June 15, Washington, whose military council had already proved invaluable on two committees, was nominated and chosen by a unanimous vote. Beyond the considerations noted, he owed being chosen to the facts that Virginia stood with Massachusetts as one of the most powerful colonies, that his appointment would augment the zeal of the Southern people, that he had gained an enduring reputation in the Braddock campaign, and that his poise, sense, and resolution had impressed all the delegates. The scene of his election, with Washington darting modestly into an adjoining room and John Hancock flushing with jealous mortification, will always impress the historical imagination. So also will the scene of July 3, 1775, when, wheeling his horse under an elm in front of the troops paraded on Cambridge Common, he drew his sword and took command of the army investing Boston. News of Bunker Hill had reached him before he was a day's journey from Philadelphia, and he had expressed confidence of victory when told how the militia had fought. In accepting the command, he refused any payment beyond his expenses and called upon every gentleman in the room to bear witness that he disclaimed fitness for it. At once he showed characteristic decision and energy in organizing the raw volunteers, collecting provisions and munitions, and rallying Congress and the colonies to his support. The first phase of Washington's command covered the period from July 1775 to the British evacuation of Boston in March 1776. In those 8 months, he imparted discipline to the army, which at maximum strength slightly exceeded 20,000. He dealt with subordinates who, as John Adams said, quarreled like cats and dogs, and he kept the siege vigorously alive. Having himself planned an invasion of Canada by Lake Champlain, to be entrusted to General Philip Schuyler, he heartily approved of Benedict Arnold's proposal to march north along the Kennebec River in Maine and take Quebec. Giving Arnold 1,100 men, he instructed him to do everything possible to conciliate the Canadians. He was equally active in encouraging privateers to attack British commerce. As fast as means offered, he strengthened his army with ammunition and siege guns. Having heavy artillery brought from Fort Ticonderoga, New York, over the frozen roads early in 1776, his position was at first precarious, for the Charles River pierced the center of his lines investing Boston. If the British general, Sir William Howe, had moved his 20 veteran regiments boldly up the stream, he might have pierced Washington's army and rolled either wing back to destruction. But all the generalship was on Washington's side, seeing that Dorchester Heights, just south of Boston, commanded the city and harbor, and that Howe had unaccountably failed to occupy it. He seized it on the night of March 4, 1776, placing his Ticonderoga guns in position. The British naval commander declared that he could not remain if the Americans were not dislodged, and Howe, after a storm, disrupted his plans for an assault. evacuated the city on March 17. He left 200 cannons and invaluable stores of small arms and munitions. After collecting his booty, Washington hurried south to take up the defense of New York. Washington had won the first round, but there remained 5 years of the war, during which the American cause was repeatedly near complete disaster. It is unquestionable that Washington's strength of character, his ability to hold the confidence of army and people, and to diffuse his own courage among them, his unremitting activity, and his strong common sense constituted the chief factors in achieving American victory. He was not a great tactician. As Jefferson said later, he often failed in the field. He was sometimes guilty of grave military blunders, the chief being his assumption of a position on Long Island, New York, in 1776 that exposed his entire army to capture the moment it was defeated. At the outset, he was painfully inexperienced, the wilderness fighting of the French War having done nothing to teach him the strategy of maneuvering whole armies. One of his chief faults was his tendency to subordinate his own judgment to that of the generals surrounding him. At every critical juncture, before Boston, before New York, before Philadelphia, and in New Jersey, he called a council of war, and in almost every instance accepted its decision. Naturally bold and dashing as he proved at Trenton and Princeton, as well as at Germantown, he repeatedly adopted evasive and delaying tactics on the advice of his associates. However, he did succeed in keeping a strong army in existence and maintaining the flame of national spirit. When the auspicious moment arrived, he planned the rapid movements that ended the war. One element of Washington's strength was his sternness as a disciplinarian. The army was continually dwindling and refilling. Politics largely governed the selection of officers by Congress and the states. And the ill-fed, ill-clothed, ill-paid forces were often half-prostrated by sickness and ripe for mutiny. Troops from each of the three sections, New England, the Middle States, and the South, showed a deplorable jealousy of the others. Washington was rigorous in breaking cowardly, inefficient, and dishonest men, and boasted in front of Boston that he had made a pretty good sort of slam among such kind of officers. Deserters and plunderers were flogged, and Washington once erected a gallows 40 feet, 12 meters, high, writing, "I am determined, if I can be justified in the proceeding, to hang 2 or 3 on it, as an example to others." At the same time, the commander-in-chief won the devotion of many of his men by his earnestness in demanding better treatment for them from Congress. He complained of their short rations, declaring once that they were forced to eat every kind of horse food. But hey, the darkest chapter in Washington's military leadership was opened when, reaching New York in April 1776, he placed half his army, about 9,000 men, under Israel Putnam, on a perilous position of Brooklyn Heights, Long Island, where a British fleet in the East River might cut off their retreat. He spent a fortnight in May with the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, then discussing the question of independence. Though no record of his utterances exists, there can be no doubt that he advocated complete separation. His return to New York preceded but slightly the arrival of the British Army under Howe, which made its main encampment on Staten Island until its whole strength of nearly 30,000 could be mobilized. On August 22, 1776, Howe moved about 20,000 men across to Gravesend Bay on Long Island. 4 days later, sending the fleet under command of his brother A.D.M. Richard Howe to make a feint against New York City, he thrust a crushing force along feebly protected roads against the American flank. The Patriots were outmaneuvered, defeated, and suffered a total loss of 5,000 men, of whom 2,000 were captured. Their whole position might have been carried by storm. But, fortunately for Washington, General Howe delayed. While the enemy lingered, Washington succeeded under cover of a dense fog in ferrying the remaining force across the East River to Manhattan, where he took up a fortified position. The British, suddenly landing on the lower part of the island, drove back the Americans in a clash marked by disgraceful cowardice on the part of troops from Connecticut and others. In a series of actions, Washington was forced northward, more than once in danger of capture, until the loss of his 2 Hudson River forts, one of them with 2,600 men, compelled him to retreat from White Plains across the river into New Jersey. He retired toward the Delaware River while his army melted away, until it seemed that armed resistance to the British was about to expire. The Trenton-Princeton campaign of George Washington. It was at this darkest hour of the Revolution that Washington struck his brilliant blows at Trenton and Princeton in New Jersey, reviving the hopes and energies of the nation. Howe, believing that the American army soon would dissolve totally, retired to New York, leaving strong forces in Trenton and Burlington. Washington, at his camp west of the Delaware River, planned a simultaneous attack on both posts, using his whole command of 6,000 men, but his subordinates in charge of both wings failed him, and he was left on the night of December 25, 1776, to march on Trenton with about 2,400 men, with the help of Colonel John Glover's regiment, which was comprised of fishermen and sailors from Marblehead, Massachusetts. Washington and his troops were ferried across the Delaware River in the dead of night and amid a blinding snowstorm. They then marched 10 miles, 16 kilometers, downstream, and in the early hours of the morning caught the enemy at Trenton unaware. In less than 2 hours and without the loss of a single man in battle, Washington's troops defeated the Hessians, killed their commander, Johann Rall, and captured nearly 1,000 prisoners and arms and ammunition. This historic Christmas crossing proved to be a turning point in the war, and it was immortalized for posterity by Emanuel Gottlieb Leutz in his famous 1851 painting of the event. The painting is historically inaccurate. The depicted flag is anachronistic. The boats are the wrong size and shape, and it is questionable whether Washington could have crossed the icy Delaware while standing in the manner depicted. The immediate result of this American victory was that General Charles Cornwallis hastened with about 8,000 men to Trenton, where he found Washington strongly posted behind the Assunpink Creek, skirmished with him, and decided to wait overnight to bag the Old Fox. During the night, the wind shifted, the roads froze hard, and Washington was able to steal away from camp, leaving his fires deceptively burning, march around Cornwallis's rear, and fall at daybreak upon the 3 British regiments at Princeton. These were put to flight with a loss of 500 men, and Washington escaped with more captured munitions to a strong position at Morristown, New Jersey. The effect of these victories heartened all Americans, brought recruits flocking to camp in the spring, and encouraged foreign sympathizers with the American cause. Thus far, the important successes had been won by Washington. Then battlefield success fell to others, while he was left to face popular apathy, military cabals, and the disaffection of Congress. The year 1777 was marked by the British capture of Philadelphia and the surrender of British General John Burgoyne's invading army to General Horatio Gates at Saratoga, New York, followed by intrigues to displace Washington from his command. Howe's main British army of 18,000 left New York by sea on July 23, 1777, and landed on August 25 in Maryland, not far below Philadelphia. Washington, despite his inferiority of force, he had only 11,000 men, mostly militia, and, in the Marquis de Lafayette's words, badly armed and worse clothed, risked a pitched battle on September 11 at the fords of Brandywine Creek, about 13 miles, 21 kilometers, north of Wilmington, Delaware. While part of the British force held the Americans engaged, General Cornwallis, with the rest, made a secret 17-mile, 27 km detour and fell with crushing effect on the American right and rear, the result being a complete defeat from which Washington was fortunate to extricate his army in fairly good order. For a time he hoped to hold the Schuylkill fords, but the British passed them and on September 26 triumphantly marched into Philadelphia. Congress fled to the interior of Pennsylvania, and Washington, after an unsuccessful effort to repeat his stroke at Trenton against the British troops posted at Germantown, had to take up winter quarters at Valley Forge. His army, twice beaten, ill-housed, and ill-fed, with thousands of men barefoot and otherwise naked, was at the point of exhaustion. It could not keep the field, for inside of a month it would have disappeared. Under these circumstances, there is nothing that better proves the true fiber of Washington's character and the courage of his soul than the unyielding persistence with which he held his strong position at Valley Forge through a winter of semi-starvation, of justified grumbling by his men, of harsh public criticism, and of captious meddling by a Congress that was too weak to help him. In February, Martha Washington arrived and helped to organize entertainment for the soldiers. Washington's enemies seized the moment of his greatest weakness to give vent to an antagonism that had been enriched by sectional jealousies of North against South, by the ambition of small rivals, and by baseless accusations that he showed favoritism to such foreigners as Lafayette. The intrigues of Thomas Conway, an Irish adventurer who had served in the French army and had become an American general, enlisted Thomas Mifflin, Charles Lee, Benjamin Rush, and others in an attempt to displace Washington. General Gates appears to have been a tool of rather than a party to the plot, expecting that the chief command would devolve upon himself. A faction of Congress sympathized with the movement and attempted to paralyze Washington by reorganizing the Board of War, a body vested with the General Superintendents of Operations, of which Gates became the president, his chief of staff, James Wilkinson, the secretary, and Mifflin and Timothy Pickering, members. Washington was well aware of the hostility in Congress, of the slanders spread by Rush and James Lovell of Massachusetts, and of the effective forgeries published in the American press by adroit British agents. He realized the intense jealousy of many New Englanders, which made even John Adams write his wife that he was thankful Burgoyne had not been captured by Washington, who would then have been deified. It is bad enough as it is. But Washington decisively crushed the cabal. After the loose tongue of Wilkinson disclosed Conway's treachery, Washington sent the general on November 9, 1777, proof of his knowledge of the whole affair. With the conclusion of the French alliance in the spring of 1778, the aspect of the war was radically altered. The British Army in Philadelphia, fearing that a French fleet would blockade the Delaware while the militia of New Jersey and Pennsylvania invested the city, hastily retreated upon New York City. Washington hoped to cut off part of the enemy, and by a hurried march with 6 brigades interposed himself at the end of June between Sir Henry Clinton, who had succeeded Howe, and the New Jersey coast. The result was the Battle of Monmouth on June 28, where a shrewd strategic plan and vigorous assault were brought to naught by the treachery of Charles Lee. When Lee ruined the attack by a sudden order to retreat, Washington hurried forward, fiercely denounced him, and restored the line. But the golden opportunity had been lost. The British made good their march to Sandy Hook, and Washington took up his quarters at New Brunswick. Lee was arrested, court-martialed, and convicted on all 3 of the charges made against him. But instead of being shot, as he deserved, he was sentenced to a suspension from command for 1 year. The arrival of the French fleet under A.D.M. Charles Hector staying on July 1778 completed the isolation of the British, and Clinton was thenceforth held to New York City and the surrounding area. Washington made his headquarters in the highlands of the Hudson and distributed his troops in cantonments around the city and in New Jersey. The final decisive stroke of the war, the capture of Cornwallis at Yorktown, is to be credited chiefly to Washington's vision. With the domestic situation intensely gloomy early in 1781, he was hampered by the feebleness of Congress, the popular discouragement, and the lack of prompt and strong support by the French fleet. A French army under the Comte de Rochambeau had arrived to reinforce him in 1780, and Washington had pressed Admiral de Grasse to assist in an attack upon either Cornwallis in the south or Clinton in New York. In August, the French admiral sent definite word that he preferred the Chesapeake, with its large area and deep water, as the scene of his operations. And within a week, on August 19, 1781, Washington marched south with his army, leaving General William Heath with 4,000 men to hold West Point. He hurried his troops for New Jersey, embarked them on transports in Delaware Bay, and landed them at Williamsburg, Virginia, where he had arrived on September 14. Cornwallis had retreated to Yorktown and entrenched his army of 7,000 British regulars. Their works were completely invested before the end of the month. The siege was pressed with vigor by the Allied armies under Washington, consisting of 5,500 Continentals, 3,500 Virginia militia, and 5,000 French regulars. And on October 19, Cornwallis surrendered. By this campaign, probably the finest single display of Washington's generalship, the war was brought to a virtual close. Washington remained during the winter of 1781–82 with the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, exhorting it to maintain its exertion for liberty and to settle the Army's claims for pay. He continued these exhortations after he joined his command at Newburgh on the Hudson in April 1782. He was astounded and angered when some loose camp suggestions found expression in a letter from Col. Louis Nicola offering a plan by which he should use the army to make himself king. He blasted the proposal with fierce condemnation. When the discontent of his unpaid men came to a head in the circulation of the Newburgh Address, an anonymously written grievance, early in 1783, he issued a general order censuring the paper, and at a meeting of officers on March 15 read a speech admonishing the army to obey Congress and promising his best efforts for a redress of grievances. He was present at the entrance of the American army into New York on the day of the British evacuation, November 25, 1783. And on December 4 took leave of his closest officers in an affecting scene at Fraunces Tavern. Traveling south, on December 23, in a solemn ceremonial immortalized by the pen of William Makepeace Thackeray, He resigned his commission to the Continental Congress in the State Senate Chamber of Maryland in Annapolis and received the thanks of the nation. His accounts of personal expenditures during his service, kept with minute exactness in his own handwriting and totaling £24,700, without charge for salary, had been given the controller of the Treasury to be discharged. Washington left Annapolis at sunrise of December 24, and before nightfall was at home in Mount Vernon. In the next 4 years, Washington found sufficient occupation in his estates, wishing to close his days as a gentleman farmer and to give to agriculture as much energy and thought as he had to the army. He enlarged the Mount Vernon house. He laid out the grounds anew, with sunken walls, or hawhas, and he embarked on experiments with mahogany, palmetto, pepper, and other foreign trees, and English grasses and grains. His farm manager during the Revolution, a distant relative named Lund Washington, retired in 1785 and was succeeded by a nephew, Match, George Augustine Washington, who resided at Mount Vernon until his death in 1792. Washington's losses during the war had been heavy, caused by neglect of his lands, stoppage of exportation, and depreciation of paper money, which cost him hardly less than $30,000. He then attempted successfully to repair his fortunes, his annual receipts from all his estates being from $10,000 to $15,000 a year. In 1784, he made a tour of nearly 700 miles, 1,125 kilometers, to view the wild lands he owned to the westward, Congress having made him a generous grant. As a national figure, he was constrained to offer hospitality to old Army friends, visitors from other states and nations, diplomats, and Indian delegations, and he and his household seldom sat down to dinner alone. Presidency of George Washington, post-revolutionary politics, viewing the chaotic political condition of the United States after 1783 with frank pessimism and declaring, May 18, 1786, that something must be done, or the fabric must fall, for it is certainly tottering. Washington repeatedly wrote his friends urging steps toward an indissoluble union. At first he believed that the Articles of Confederation might be amended. Later, especially after the shock of Shays's rebellion, he took the view that a more radical reform was necessary, but doubted as late as the end of 1786 that the time was ripe. His progress toward adoption of the idea of a federal convention was, in fact, puzzlingly slow. Although John Jay assured him in March 1786 that breakup of the nation seemed near, and opinion for a constitutional convention was crystallizing, Washington remained noncommittal. But, despite long hesitations, he earnestly supported the proposal for a federal impost, warning the states that their policy must decide whether the revolution must ultimately be considered a blessing or a curse. And his numerous letters to the leading men of the country assisted greatly to form a sentiment favorable to a more perfect union, some understanding being necessary between Virginia and Maryland regarding the navigation of the Potomac. Commissioners from the two states had met at Mount Vernon in the spring of 1785. From this seed sprang the Federal Convention. Washington approved in advance the call for a gathering of all the states to meet in Philadelphia in May 1787 to render the Constitution of the federal government adequate to the exigencies of the Union. But he was again hesitant about attending, partly because he felt tired and infirm, partly because of doubts about the outcome, although he hoped to the last to be excused. He was chosen one of Virginia's 5 delegates. Washington arrived in Philadelphia on May 13, the day before the opening of the Constitutional Convention, and as soon as a quorum was obtained, he was unanimously chosen its president. For 4 months, he presided over the convention, breaking his silence only once upon a minor question of congressional apportionment. Although he said little in debate, no one did more outside the hall to insist on stern measures. "My wish is," he wrote, "that the convention may adopt no temporizing expedients, but probe the defects of the Constitution to the bottom and provide a radical cure." His weight of character did more than any other single force to bring the convention to an agreement and obtain ratification of the instrument afterward. He did not believe it perfect, though his precise criticisms of it are unknown, but his support gave it victory in Virginia, where he sent copies to Patrick Henry and other leaders with a hint that the alternative to adoption was anarchy, declaring that it or disunion is before us to choose from. He received and personally circulated copies of the Federalist. When ratification was obtained, he wrote to leaders in the various states urging that men staunchly favorable to it be elected to Congress. For a time he sincerely believed that, the new framework completed, he he would be allowed to retire again to privacy. But all eyes immediately turned to him for the first president. He alone commanded the respect of both the parties engendered by the struggle over ratification, and he alone would be able to give prestige to the Republic throughout Europe. In no state was any other name considered. The electors chosen in the first days of 1789 cast a unanimous vote for him, and reluctantly for his love of peace, his distrust of his own abilities, and his fear that his motives in advocating the new government might be misconstrued all made him unwilling. He accepted. On April 16, after receiving congressional notification of the honor, he set out from Mount Vernon, reaching New York City in time to be inaugurated on April 30. His journey northward was a celebratory procession as people in every town and village through which he passed turned out to greet him, often with banners and speeches, and in some places with triumphal arches. He came across the Hudson River in a specially built barge decorated in red, white, and blue. The inaugural ceremony was performed on Wall Street, near the spot now marked by John Quincy Adams Ward's statue of Washington. A great crowd broke into cheers as, standing on the balcony of Federal Hall, he took the oath administered by Chancellor Robert Livingston and retired indoors to read Congress his inaugural address. Washington was clad in a brown suit of American manufacture, but he wore white stockings and a sword after the fashion of European courts. Martha was as reluctant as her husband to resume public life, but a month later she came from Mount Vernon to join him. She, too, was greeted wildly on her way, and when Washington crossed the Hudson to bring her to Manhattan, guns boomed in salute. The Washingtons, to considerable public criticism, traveled about in a coach and four like monarchs. Moreover, during his presidency, Washington did not shake hands, and he met his guests on state occasions while standing on a raised platform and displaying a sword on his hip. Slowly, feeling his way, Washington was defining the style of the first president of a country in the history of the world. The people, too, were adjusting to a government without a king. Even the question of how to address a president had to be discussed. It was decided that in a republic the simple salutation "Mr. President" would do. The Washington administration. Washington's administration of the government in the next 8 years was marked by the caution, the methodical precision, and the sober judgment that had always characterized him. He regarded himself as standing aloof from party divisions and emphasized his position as president of the whole country by touring first through the northern states and later through the southern. A painstaking inquiry into all the problems confronting the new nation laid the basis for a series of judicious recommendations to Congress in his first message. In selecting the 4 members of his first cabinet, Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of Treasury, Henry Knox as Secretary of War, and Edmund Randolph as Attorney General, Washington balanced the two parties evenly, but he leaned with especial weight upon Hamilton, who supported his scheme for the federal assumption of state debts, took his view that the bill establishing the Bank of the United States was constitutional, and in general favored strengthening the authority of the federal government. Distressed when the inevitable clash between Jefferson and Hamilton arose, he tried to keep harmony, writing frankly to each and refusing to accept their resignations. But when war was declared between France and England in 1793, he took Hamilton's view that the United States should completely disregard the Treaty of Alliance with France and pursue a course of strict neutrality, while he acted decisively to stop the improper operations of the French minister, Edmond Charles Genet. He had a firm belief that the United States must insist on its national identity, strength, and dignity. His object, he wrote, was to keep the country free from political connections with every other country, to see them independent of all, and under the influence of none. In a word, I want an American character, that the powers of Europe may be convinced that we act for ourselves, and not for others. The sequel was the resignation of Jefferson at the close of 1793. The two men parting on good terms and Washington praising Jefferson's integrity and talents. The suppression of the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794 by federal troops, whom Hamilton led in person, and the dispatch of John Jay to conclude a treaty of commerce with Great Britain tended further to align Washington with the Federalists. Although the general voice of the people compelled him to acquiesce reluctantly to a second term in 1792, and his election that year was again unanimous. During his last 4 years in office, he suffered from a fierce personal and partisan animosity. This culminated when the publication of the terms of the Jay Treaty, which Washington signed in August 1795, provoked a bitter discussion, and the House of Representatives called upon the president for the instructions and correspondence relating to the treaty. These Washington, who had already clashed with the Senate on foreign affairs, refused to deliver, and, in the face of an acrimonious debate, he firmly maintained his position. Early in his first term, Washington, who by education and natural inclination was minutely careful of the proprieties of life, established the rules of a virtual Republican court. In both New York and Philadelphia, he rented the best houses procurable, refusing to accept the hospitality of George Clinton, for he believed the head of the nation should be no man's guest. He returned no calls and shook hands with no one. Acknowledging salutations by a formal bow, he drove in a coach drawn by 4 or 6 smart horses, with outriders and lackeys in rich livery. He attended receptions dressed in a black velvet suit with gold buckles, with yellow gloves, powdered hair, a cocked hat with an ostrich plume in one hand, and a sword in a white leather scabbard. After being overwhelmed by callers, he announced that, except for a weekly levee open to all, persons desiring to see him had to make appointments in advance. On Friday afternoons, the First Lady held informal receptions, at which the President appeared. Although the presidents of the Continental Congress had made their tables partly public, Washington, who entertained largely, inviting members of Congress in rotation, insisted that his hospitality be private. He served good wines, and the menus were elaborate. But such visitors as Pennsylvania Sen. William Maclay complained that the atmosphere was too solemn. Indeed, his simple ceremony offended many of the more radical anti-federalists, who did not share his sense of its fitness, and accused the president of conducting himself like a king. But his cold and reserved manner was caused by native diffidence rather than any excessive sense of dignity. Retirement, earnestly desiring leisure, feeling a decline of his physical powers, and wincing under abuses of the opposition, Washington refused to yield to the general pressure for a third term. This refusal was blended with a testament of sagacious advice to his country in the farewell address of September 19, 1796, written largely by Hamilton, but remolded by Washington and expressing his ideas. Retiring in March 1797 to Mount Vernon, he devoted himself for the last 2.5 years of his life to his family, farm operations, and care of his slaves. In 1798, his seclusion was briefly interrupted when the prospect of war with France caused his appointment as commander-in-chief of the Provisional Army, and he was much worried by the political quarrels over high commissions. But the war cloud passed away on December 12, 1799. After riding on horseback for several hours in cold and snow, he returned home exhausted and was attacked late the next day with quinsy or acute laryngitis. He was bled heavily 4 times and given gargles of molasses, vinegar and butter, and a blister of cantharides, a preparation of dried beetles, was placed on his throat. His strength meanwhile rapidly sinking, he faced the end with characteristic serenity, saying, "I die hard, but I am not afraid to go." And later, "I feel myself go. I thank you for your attentions, but I pray you to take no more trouble about me. Let me go off quietly. I cannot last long." After giving instructions to his secretary, Tobias Lear, about his burial, he died at 10 o'clock on December 14. The news of his death placed the entire country in mourning, and the sentiment of the country endorsed the famous words of Henry, "Light Horse Harry" Lee, embodied in resolutions that John Marshall introduced in the House of Representatives, that he was first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. When the news reached Europe, the British Channel Fleet and the armies of Napoleon paid tribute to his memory, and many of the leaders of the time joined in according him a preeminent place among the heroes of history. His fellow citizens memorialized him forever by naming the newly created capital city of the young nation for him while he was still alive. Later, one of the states of Union would bear his name, the only state named for an individual American. Moreover, counties in 32 states were given his name, and in time it also could be found in 121 postal addresses. The people of the United States have continued to glory in knowing him as the father of his country, an accolade he was pleased to accept, even though it pained him that he fathered no children of his own. For almost a century, beginning in the 1770s, Washington was the incontested giant in the American pantheon of greats, but only until Abraham Lincoln was enshrined there after another critical epoch in the life of the country.